So we're here with the lovely Laura Jane Grace, who has just released a new album and a book, and we would love to talk to you about that book.
Excellent.
How long ago did it formally come out?
The book came out on November 14th, I think it was, of this past year, and the record came out in September, but I forget the exact date.
Right, so you're doing, double time press now.
Yeah. I basically started doing press in August. I think in the month of August, there were only 3 days that I didn't do interviews. It was like pretty brutal.
So that was a 4-year process.
Yeah, like 4 years in earnest of like when I was like, I want to write a book, and like sought out a literary agent and sought out a book deal, I guess, if you want to like look at it from there, and started like really compiling stuff and putting it together. I was really fascinated, having had experience in the music industry, of like seeing the parallels between a publishing house and a record label, and like that essentially in order to get a book deal, like you kind of got to do demos of a book. So like I had to do my book demo of like writing out like, this is what my book would be about. This is like kind of a loose chapter breakdown the way I foresee it, and then passing it around and seeing like, if anyone was interested.
Yeah. And when I saw the title, I was actually super happy. I was like, oh, great, she's doing the Dick Gregory method of usurping words that you just don't like.
Sure.
So I was really stoked. I thought it was a great title and subtitle. You've mentioned that you hate that word. You hate both those phrases.
Right.
Having to talk about the book so much, has it rubbed off? Do you still treat it with vitriol, or?
I mean, it's like, every situation is different, and like context is everything, you know? So like doing an interview like this and talking about it is one thing. Sometimes doing like a morning radio show where it's like a 10-minute long segment and they start dropping your book title and they're like in between, like, you're listening to The Buzz, like it's like, okay, fuck, this feels really wrong, on multiple levels. So it's all about context with that. But I do think it's like, having the chance to explain it and to talk about the word tranny, like as a title, Confessions of Punk Rock's Most Infamous Anarchist Sellout. As a writer, as an artist, like, there are only a couple words that hold that much power, that like so many people will debate around, talk about, and like that's fascinating to me. You know, so like I don't identify with the word tranny. I don't want it used towards me. At the same time, from like the trans perspective, there's an older generation of trans people who have used that word in a positive way, self-referentially. So like there's the younger generation of trans people who don't want anything to do with that word, and then there's an older generation, and there's the divide there. And I've always been like, well, who am I to come in and say like, no, you can't use the word, or like, you must use the word.
Right.
Like I just have kind of like almost been an observer in some ways, even though I am trans myself. So, my relationship with the word is complicated, but as a book title, like indicating like how much like self-loathing is present in the book and how much internalized transphobia is talked about in the book, that like was alluding to the title as well.
Right. Yeah, because you had mentioned that you were kind of bracing yourself for hearing that word, and I think the first time you heard it kind of surprised you. It was another trans person that had said it, and you were kind of taken aback.
Just in like a friendly, like, yay, what's up, like type of way, where I was like, whoa, oh, okay, all right. I don't know what to say now, because I just expected it to be like hurled at the back of my head, like while walking down a street or something like that. And so it caught me off guard in that way, and I had to process it in real time,
Yeah, no, I really like that. And then I found the article that you had actually written about it. You wrote, "In art, freedom of speech and expression must be complete and total." And I absolutely agree with you, and I'm really happy to see that was the attitude that you adopted, even with this really hard personal subject.
Right on, yeah.
And then it kind of got me thinking, too, that it always seems that in the arts are kind of ahead of the curve in social acceptance, If it's the 1940s or 50s society and there's racial segregation out there, it seems like the really hip musicians, the really hip comedians are like, no, I'm going to the jazz clubs. Like, that's where I can find the best music.
Right.
And then the trans issue in the public eye seems to be fairly new. I mean, 10 years ago, the civil rights kind of forefront would have been gay marriage, something like that. But if you go back to the 60s, you can see that like Candy Darling, for example, I mean, is a muse for amazing songs by some of the most amazing artists.
Right.
The arts have not cared about that issue for a long time, and kind of rightfully so.
Right.
And you being an artist, I think, I think people have probably asked you this, but do you feel a lot of the pressure as kind of an ambassador for something that isn't in the public eye so much? Or
yes and no. I mean, like, I don't like wake up feeling like, oh, this pressure or something like that, you know, but like I feel conscious of it, you know, like of that of that being the case, you know, that there isn't a lot of representation or whatever. And I do recognize I have a platform, you know, so like talking about it and talking about something that's real, I'm happy to do, you know. And also I kind of like just early on accepted it, you know, of like, okay, like coming out and telling people that I was trans, like realizing that I still wanted to continue being in a band and being a musician, you know, like that I'd have to do interviews and people would ask about that. Sure. And that I never had the option of like, of pretending my past life didn't happen. You know, it just was never an option for me. So I kind of just had to accept that, you know?
Right. There's a difference between the book press and doing the record thing. So you're not really a stranger to being kind of letting people into your interior kind of dialogue. I mean, one thing that kind of struck me, you had dedicated it to Evelyn. Have you thought about when it'll be appropriate for her to read? Like, obviously you don't want to hide it from your family or anything like that, but
right.
I'm just super curious.
Yeah, no, I mean, I have thought about those things. Obviously, like putting out a book, you're like, okay, like my kid's possibly going to read this, you know, or like what effect is this going to have on my kid, you know, like, and it's terrifying to me. But it's like, I feel that way in regards to even records I did in the past. You know, like there's that same thing of like, okay,
yeah,
you know,
like
phrase
that. I was trying to say.
No, like what is this going to mean to your kid? You know, or like what is how are they going to view that? And like, I mean, I already had. The thing is that like, I guess that you know the things that are talked about in the book that would have been issues you'd maybe have to explain to your kid are things that would have existed with or without the book, you know? Sure. The fact that like I was arrested when I was 14 years old, you know, or like 17 or 18 years old as well. And like talking about like addiction issues and stuff like that, those are things that were there anyways, you know, and would have, I guess, in theory, could have possibly had to have been talked about. And in particular with talking about like addiction stuff or like substance abuse stuff, like as a kid, no one ever talked to me about those things. My parents never said a single thing to me about alcohol, marijuana, cocaine, or LSD, or anything like that. Yeah. You know, never. So I was able to, on my own, find those things and develop my own relationship with them. Sure. So I'm not sure, like, if not talking, I don't feel like not talking about them is the right answer. Yeah. So talking about them, I don't know. All you can do is be honest, you know?
Yeah. And you have to kind of judge, like, when's going to be the right time, or
right.
Maybe you won't get to choose. I don't know.
No, I mean, certainly, you know, like it's you know, I think all you can do is like try your hardest as a parent and like make sure that, you know, your kid is like, I don't know, has the right schooling, you know, like I put a lot of emphasis on education, you know, and making sure like my daughter goes to a good school and is with a good group of kids, you know.
So you want what parents want.
Yeah,
the best.
Yeah. And I mean, it's like being a parent's tough. Like, yeah, I feel like, you know, it's cliches, like, but you're going to make mistakes, you know, like it just is the way it is.
Yeah. So I did want to touch on a few things. I wanted to touch on literature that you enjoy, like books that have been good. But I also wanted to talk about, your career arc. Like right now, you know, you've gone from a completely independent artist making an album in your bedroom on an 8-track. Mm-hmm. Then you get on a independent label, a pretty cool indie label. Then you go to a large indie. Then you go to the majors. Mm-hmm. And then now I was really happy to hear that, you know, you've got your own label, you've got your own studio. I don't know, I just like it when people are entrepreneurs and have control, right?
Right on, yeah.
What I'm wondering is, like, if you had advice for somebody, for bands starting out now, like what value did you extract from those last 3 kind of levels when you were on other labels and stuff like that? Perspective
is super important, you know, and that was like kind of like learning that as we went, where we started out very much like we're going to do our own records, but a lot of that was out of necessity because like, especially in South Florida, there was no record label.
Right.
So it was like, okay, in order to put something out, we're going to have to put it out ourselves. And then doing that first couple times, realizing like, oh, we really don't know how to do this, like whether that was like the home recording aspect of it or the actual like pressing of it and distribution aspect of it. So then it was like, okay, like maybe it would be smart if we want to be that band that's out on tour all the time, we're going to need a label that's like, stuffing envelopes with records and mailing them out. And then graduating onto bigger indies, realizing like the way they did things, and thinking like, whoa, this is incredible. And then working with bigger indies and seeing like the parallels between that and, then moving on to a major eventually, it was like the lesson learned kind of was that, okay, a label is a label, right? Yeah. And some labels do this thing really well and other labels do this thing really well. From a capitalist standpoint, like all labels serve the same function and all labels make money and they're doing something with the money. So like you kind of have to give away that illusion or whatever. But realizing, like sometimes it's better to have less people working on a thing. Sometimes you need more people working on a thing, but that there's just different drawbacks and benefits with each situation, Right. And that's even between like, okay, here's this major label and this major label. This major label does this thing really good and this major label does this thing really good. So like, what do you think you need more? So it was really learning experiences with that. On a studio level, like working with other producers, the first time you go into a recording studio, it's intimidating as fuck. And you're like, okay, there's all this racks of gear and like this cool looking, like mixing board, and I don't know how any of it works. Yeah. And I hear this thing in my head, but I don't even know how to explain how I want it to sound to this person. So oftentimes your sound is being dictated by the engineer or producer thinking they know what you want or whatever. So eventually getting to a point where you have enough experience from having worked with different producers and engineers to being like, okay, now I know how to use this equipment. I think that's really valuable as opposed to just hard-headedly going into a situation and being like, I'll figure it out. I know how to do everything really well. Like that's just being dumb. Being so humble as to be like, teach me how to do this, and like being so lucky to have the opportunity to work with people who have worked with other bands that you admired as a kid, or like to learn from them and to take from those situations and then apply it to what you want to do. Like I never saw any conflict with that and being DIY, of like being humble and being like, teach me something.
So I think we all go through that. We all have a problem where we think we know everything when we're young, and that's also when we're super creative and starting bands or whatever. Have you found a formula where you're like, shut the fuck up, this is where you need to learn something, or this is where you need to trust yourself? Like, did you ever sort it out?
Not a formula per se, but I mean, I definitely like feel like I've tempered over the years, and like a real good learning lesson is like producing other bands and being in that situation where you're not actually in the band, but you're in the studio and you hear the conversations bands have and you're like, oh, we have that exact same conversation. And holy shit, do we sound stupid? Yeah. Like, now I'm realizing this right now. That's like really valuable. And just like, but that's like, part of my mentality has always been like, learn every angle of it, Sure. So if I can see it from a different perspective, it'll be beneficial to me being in a band, know? But a lot of it's just like knowing when to listen, knowing when to have patience, knowing when to like really fight for an idea and not listen to anyone else. And just because sometimes you do need to do that, because oftentimes you'll have an idea and other people won't be seeing your vision, and you just have to like be like, no, I'm doing this, and either you're on board or you're not, There's no formula. I wish it was like a scientific like thing I could write out on a chalkboard,
Yeah. A cool thing I learned from the books too is where you kind of had these aha moments, and I think a lot of people do. Yours was that experience where you got Green Day's tape, for example, from a lady named Debbie who owned a record store called
Offbeat Music.
Is that still around?
No, it closed down in like probably like 1997 or so, something like that. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So that happened around 1994.
93, 94, yeah, somewhere around
and
there.
That was your introduction to punk rock.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And now, fast forward now, and today you're about to open for Green Day.
Yeah.
Which was also kind of your big arena genesis as well in 2005. Like,
sure.
We talked about this before, so I know the answer, but it's still surreal that
Completely. I mean, like I say it on stage every night, like Green Day was the first concert I ever went to. You know, like it wasn't the first album I bought, but like it was really my like entrance into modern punk rock. Cause like I had heard the Sex Pistols and I had heard a couple of the bands that everyone first hears when they start listening to punk, but all those bands had been long broken up. So Green Day was like the first band where it was like, this is a band that's punk and they're still active. And I remember like going to the show, my friend Dustin's dad drove us and we dyed our hair green with like spray on dye. And I remember like seeing the circle pit and being like, that is the scariest thing I've ever seen, but all right, I'm going in. And I probably weighed like 90 pounds soaking wet and like you get your ass kicked in the pit and you're like, that was miserable and totally terrifying, but I guess I'm going in again. And like by the end of it, your skin's like dyed green from the hair dye. And I mean, I just like have so many memories from that show. And then like 2005, we got asked to do Giant Stadium with them, Foxborough Stadium in a soccer arena out in LA. And that was just like totally surreal where flying into Newark Airport, you literally flew over Giant Stadium and I was sitting in the window looking out and I could see the stage in the stadium like that tiny, you know, like being like, holy
the
shit.
Lego version.
Yeah, we're going to play on that stage down there tomorrow. And having that surreal moment of being on stage and like turning around and being like, oh, there's like, oh, hey, Trey, cool. Hey, Mike Turns, you know, and like, oh, the Bouncing Souls are here too. Oh, fuck, you know, like, and here's my, like, I had a lot of friends and family who came up for the show. And it was just like super gratifying, you know, and like, especially, you know, Green Day, like, they certainly didn't need us to sell any tickets to sell out Giant Stadium, you know, and they certainly like were super generous with what they paid us even. And like, just like super cool, and it really like showed me of like, oh, cool, like you can like
so that's a great
still
first
be
experience.
you can still be in an arena and keep it real in that way. And I think about that all the time on this tour now, where like, okay, they get up there every night and they play Knowledge, and it's like there's like 20,000 people here, and that's like how many kids hearing Operation Ivy for the first time who are going to go home and they're just going to discover Operation Ivy, and then they'll like go down the rabbit hole that I went down, and like that kind of connection and like passing it down is really important, you know?
Yeah, I've always kind of said that, like, you know, I know a guy who plays in one of the best, most brutal death metal bands ever, and he's like, you know, the first bands I listened to were Korn and Limp Bizkit. And he's not embarrassed about it because it opens a door.
Right.
So sure, you can poke fun at a kid who doesn't know anything about it. He just doesn't know it yet.
Right.
But
that is also like the Green Day show was my first experience of that kind of elitism too. The first show I went to where we had heard Rancid already, me and my friend Dustin, and they were playing Rancid on the stereo, and there was two people in front of us who were like, who's this? I wish Green Day would come on. And we're like, look at each other like, we know who this is, so we're cooler than them. Yeah. We know who Rancid is. So it was like the first experience I had with that. But yeah, I mean, that show changed my life for sure, you know?
Yeah. Have there been any books that have, now that you're an author and stuff, but have there been any books that have changed your life or something that had a pretty profound impact on you?
So many. I mean, like, I'm a pretty avid reader. Unfortunately, like, when you're writing a book, you don't tend to read a lot of books, which was like, so for like the past couple of years, I was like taking a sabbatical or whatever. But I mean, I like any rock book or any like music biography book, I'll usually read and get something out of, even if I don't like the band. So it's interesting in that way. But like, I don't know. I had like one year where my New Year's resolution was to read 12 classic novels in a year. And I went through and like read War and Peace, read Crime and Punishment, like read Steinbeck, Hemingway, like...
I actually do the same thing.
So many authors like that.
I haven't made it through Ulysses yet.
That's because it's kind of unintelligible and hard to read, but it's a great novel. Yeah,
but I'm determined to beat it.
Right.
You know,
well, when we were like the last year and a half of writing a book, I moved to Oak Park, Illinois, which is where Ernest Hemingway was born, and like moved into an apartment 3 blocks from his birth house, and like did it because I was like, oh, this will be a great setting for finishing writing this book. And then like once I was moved in, I was like, I don't even fucking like Ernest Hemingway. Why did I do this? Like, just seemed like a good idea, you know?
Well, you had mentioned it before in some other interviews. So you talked about getting the van, which is...
Right, sure. As far as like inspirations or like what I wanted to do with my book, Get in the Van was, of course, really influential. And like, you know, really like all the Comet Bus zines were too. Because I wanted it to have that kind of like almost the fanzine feeling of like hearkening. Because I used to do a fanzine and like hearkening back to that. And like, that was always like, for me, journaling too, you know, like in that style of like, I liked it where you would just be thrown into someone's world, like in Comet Bus. and there would be no, if there were like the characters of Chris, Susie, and Steven, like there would be no explanation who Chris, Susie, and Steven were. You're just following the story all the time, and all of a sudden you'd have to pick up and like kind of jump into the world head first and like get in the van, you know?
Right.
And I always really appreciated that. One of the books that like Dan, Ozzie, and I, though, like shared with each other when we were working on stuff was Born Standing, the Steve Martin biography. And really, like, both of us really attached to that book and liked that a lot. And it was one of those things which was really, like, important with our book of, like, knowing that, okay, you know, like this has to be something that someone who has no idea of punk rock can just pick up and start reading. You know, you don't have to know who Steve Martin is or like Steve Martin to pick that book and read it, because it has nothing to do with his moving career. It was just all about his stand-up career before being a successful like star in movies. So just The Diary of Candy Darling. We talked about Candy Darling earlier. That was like a huge influence, just obviously with journal entries, because her book is very much just journal entries, just there with no narrative. So it was like just kind of drawing from all those influences.
I noticed that she had like an aha moment. I didn't read it. I saw it in the documentary that they made. She had like an aha moment. What was the actress's name? She was kind of obsessed with her, and she had finally written her a letter. She loved her white hair.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about.
But it's another genesis of yours, like the Madonna moment. It seems like there's a really big parallel there, and I think both of you succeeded in that. Like that inspiration. I love what she did in her unfortunately short life. I think that art always gives a catalyst, and you know, if it's Green Day or if it's an actress, and it gives you something to shoot at.
Sure.
For me, I read Lenny Bruce's autobiography when I was 14, and now I read it every year, and it's still equally as inspirational. And I've lent it out so many times that I have to rebuy it every year because I want everybody to read it. But yeah, I think those kind of like catalytic aha moments that you can get from a great book or a great record or a great performance, a great screen performance or something like that.
Right.
I think they have a lot of value.
When I was like 13 years old to like 7th grade, around then, I was really into the Doors. And I like read every single Jim Morrison biography there was, and like read all his shitty poetry books. And like, I mean, I took a lot from that idea even of like, oh, you're like the singer in a band, but you're like really interested in literature and you're really interested in philosophers like Nietzsche, and like, oh, interesting, you know, and like, oh, that's where you're drawing your lyrics from. So I always like, I don't know if that's like cheesy to say, but I always like took from Jim Morrison in that way, even, you know, of like.
A good idea is a good idea.
Yeah, totally. I visited Jim Morrison's grave like 3 times last year, ironically. But there are those books I always come back to in that way, or authors that I come back to.
I go to Bukowski's childhood home in LA and just have a beer and think I'm going to be a good writer or something if I do it. It doesn't work, but I try.
But that's the thing, like, you know, like sometimes people will come up to me and they're like, you know, what advice would you give for like writing or whatever? And it's like, write. Like just that's simple.
That's always the advice from
everyone thinks they suck, but just write.
And you get a lot of suck, and then you can get somebody like Dan to help you whittle down.
Yeah, because it's about volume. That's right.
That's right, the kind of shotgun blast approach.
Totally.
There was another book that you had mentioned in another interview that I was curious about, and it was Sartre's diary.
Oh, yeah. I'm a huge Sartre fan, and like have read everything, you know, like Nausea, Troubled Sleep. I mean, like there's Sartre lyrics in like the song Fuck My Life 666, No More Troubled Sleep. There's a Brave New World. I mean, there's a Huxley reference in that too, but like Sartre was hugely influential to me. And in Sartre's War Diaries, it was like, I loved how, I mean, it was just literally like, you know, every detail. And that was like his philosophy. Every detail, write it down. So if it's like, woke up this morning, ate bacon and eggs, smoked a cigarette, you know, it was like, just write that shit down, because sometimes you aren't feeling creative, but you want to be in the practice of writing. So you need something to write about. So just write down whatever fucking mundane detail you can.
And that's what I like, even the mundane stuff in like a Henry Rollins journal or something. I'm like, oh, this guy drinks a lot of carrot juice. For like a week, I'll drink carrot juice.
Same, totally, so I took a lot from that for sure.
Yeah, it's a good practice. I think that's mostly what I wanted to know.
Right on.
I really appreciate you taking the time, and
my pleasure.
Good luck with your book. Like I said, I'm 4 chapters in, and I think it's really great.
Thank you very much.
It's an emotional roller coaster.
Yeah, I mean, like the parallels of writing a book and making a record too, because we were talking about this a little off camera, and I think it's worth mentioning again. It's like, it's interesting seeing that, like, and talking about why there's an Against Me record right now where, you know, having the pressure taken off of writing songs for the first time, where it was like all on writing a book.
Right.
And I had never had that before. And like being able to even like kind of draw, especially because, you know, having that much shit to like work through, drawing from the process of recording music in Pro Tools specifically, where you realize like, okay, I like this part, chop, paste. Like, oh, you can do that with writing too. So if you have this really good paragraph here, just chop it out and put it over there. And like kind of approaching writing like that, like it was helpful to draw from both areas, you know? And writing a book though, like there's so much time where you're just sitting in front of a fucking computer and like,
where's my guitar?
yeah, totally. And that's why writers drink, and that's why writers smoke cigarettes, you know?
Yeah.
And that was actually the most disappointing part, I think, of like signing a book deal. Is like I expected to go into the publishing house and for them to be like, here's a pack of cigarettes, here's a bottle of whiskey, here's the keys to the publishing house cabin. We'll see you in a couple months. Like, see what you get.
Yeah.
Like,
I think there might be a danger of like a lot of people thinking that Bukowski or somebody like that or Hemingway actually got their writing powers from the cigarettes or the drink.
That's always really
wasn't the
fascinating
case.
to me, though. I don't know if you've ever looked at charts like that where it'll show you what artist or writer, what their daily intake was. Like when their writing hours were and what kind of drugs they were taking to sustain themselves. So like Sartre was a speed freak.
Yeah.
And he would like wake up in the morning, go to his local cafe, pop some speed, smoke some cigarettes, drink some coffee, write, go home, same thing, like just all day long and be up all night long, you know?
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's always fascinating.
I think that even like people who want to be in bands or people who want to be writers, they might see like Keith Richards or whatever, but they'll be focused on the wrong thing. Like Bukowski actually wrote.
Right.
Yeah, he was a drunk and he spent a lot of time doing that. But there's more emphasis on the key part,
right,
which is writing.
Right.
Know, or Sartre or Hemingway or any of these.
Totally. And I think about that, you know, like in reference to the Rolling Stones, even that's a great example as we're sitting here in this backstage room of like, you know, so often it's always so disappointing to me where you like walk into a backstage room and every fucking person is just looking at their phone. And it's like, you know why those bands were so prolific back in the day is because they didn't have phones. So when you walked into the dressing room, they might have been drinking and smoking, but they were playing their guitars and they were fucking around with ideas. And that's like what you should be doing backstage, not looking at your fucking phone.
Yeah.